Good day once again. I'm coming to you with a great presentation on Module 6. Module 6, as you know, it's our business administration module. We've done a lecture, a video, I'm sure you have received it, on fraud in sport. And now we are going on to talk about service providers. Basically, how do you manage a service provider and how do you appoint a service provider? So I'll just run through this presentation, but before I even get to that, perhaps I should give you some just information on service providers. I'm sure you might have a question as to who is a service provider. As you might be aware that there is no organization that is self-sufficient, meaning there is no way that you can deliver all the services that you need. For example, if you are running a sports club, there is no way that you can have everything you need internally. For example, if you talk about your equipment, you cannot supply, or you may not be able to supply your own equipment. So you may need to go to a place or a retail store or an organization to supply you. Now, and we refer to those organizations as service providers. So service providers are external organizations that have got expertise in some of the things that you may not be able to offer them yourself. Now, a service provider can be an organization, like I said earlier on. It could be a company that supplies you with equipment. It could be a company that supplies you with your education and training services. It could be telecom. It could be your company that supplies you with your Wi-Fi, your telephone, and all those type of things. It could be a company that supplies you with your stationery. So we refer to these companies as service providers. So like I said earlier on, a service provider does not necessarily or it is not necessarily an organization. Sometimes it can be a person. For example, if I run a sports club and I've hired a coach, the coach that I have hired is a service provider, or the administrator that I have hired can be a service provider, or even a conditioning coach that I've hired can be a service provider. Now, as you all know that service providers must be paid. It would be very nice to do everything yourself internally, which is the best thing to do things, but clubs or companies do not always have the capacity to do everything by themselves. So one of the disadvantages in having a service provider is the fact that you lose money, because the services that they are rendering to your club or your organization, you have to pay them for those services. Now, I want to take you on a journey on this unit standard, which is very interesting and very much enlightening. So I'll look at 5 sections that will cover on the unit standard, and then that will be the end of the presentation. Now, the first section I want us to look at is the strategies to better manage a service provider. Now, service providers, once you've appointed them, you have to manage them. Remember, as much as we assume that they know their work, but you don't just dump them there and let them do as they wish. You have to manage them. You have to appoint them. You have to make sure that they do the work that you are paying them to do. So there are various strategies that we implement, and we'll unpack that subject later on. In section number 2, we look at the issues of SLAs. SLA is the service level agreement. When you appoint a service provider or a person, as you all know that there must be a contract in place that is signed between you and the person that you've appointed. Now, that becomes a legal document that perhaps you could use should in case have a disagreement. In fact, SLA, I just think it's a proper thing to do. If you are appointing a service provider, even if there will be no disputes, I think it's an ideal thing to say, can we sign a document, even if it's just a 1-page document that says you are appointed, these are your duties, this is how much you'll be paid, and you'll be paid at this time in this way. So that's very important. And number 3, We'll look at the project plan for service providers. As you all know that when you get a service provider on board, there should be a plan of implementation. Now, sometimes we refer to that plan as the roll-up plan. Sometimes we refer to it as a project plan. Sometimes we refer to it as an implementation plan. Basically, it shows exactly what needs to be done and when it needs to be done. And of course, the company and the service provider must agree about those timelines. Section number 4, we look at the selection process. You might be aware that we don't just pick up service providers by the roadside. There is a clear process that should be defined, or that should be defined by the organization. Now, usually it's a checklist, it's a tick box exercise. It shows us exactly what needs to be done from point A to the last point, so that we appoint somebody or a company that is competent to do the job that needs to be done. And the final thing we'll look at is basically the reviewing of the service provider. Service providers must be reviewed. You might review halfway through, you might review at the end, you might review maybe in your third quarter. Now, we review because we want to make sure that the person does what he was hired to do. Sometimes we review so that perhaps we can bring back the same company on board next year should we have the same job for them. Now, I want us to go on section number 1. Section number 1, as I already indicated, we are looking at strategies to better manage the service providers. Now, remember, the appointment of a service provider does not mean you don't have work to do. What it means is that you've appointed somebody who has got the right expertise to do that particular job for you. However, you are paying the person, and you have to make sure that the person is managed well, so that the person gives you the service or the product that is being paid for. So section number 1, we look at basic things you have to look at in order for the company to be well managed, or in order for the company to do their job which they are paid to do. So the first thing I want us to look at, for them to be managed well, you have to keep communication very frequent or regular. Service providers must be communicated with. You may need to have meetings weekly, monthly, quarterly, depending on the time of the contract. You may have conference calls, you may need to send emails, whatever you choose to use as a form of communication, that should be defined, and it must be very clear between the two of you. The next thing I want us to look at to keep these guys or to manage them is to look at the objectives. Now, objectives is they have to be clear that you've been appointed for this reason. So you have to make sure that whatever you've appointed them to do, they understand it, and it's very defined on the contract that they've signed. And the next thing you may need to have with these guys to manage them well is regular meetings. You may go to their premises, they might come to your premises. Now, meetings, they give everybody an idea of where we are currently. So from time to time, they have to come and present what they've done, just to give you some sort of a progress report. Now, the reason why we have meetings, you don't want to be sitting with a problem that you could have diagnosed in Jan and you only find out in December when the project is supposed to close. Now, when you have those meetings, you are likely during those meetings to pick up any form of risk that could be avoided or solved, because you still have a long way to go. And of course, the next thing I want us to look at is that you have to put things in writing. When you work with service providers, you have to write things down. That's why we have contracts. The project plan must be in writing. The contract must be in writing, and it must be signed by the two parties. And the last thing is that you need service providers, the needs of the service providers. Now, I made an example here. I said, for example, when it comes to payments. Now, if you appoint a service provider, you have to make their life quite easy. Some service providers might require you to pay upfront because they may need to procure some of the things they need to service your organization. For example, if maybe you need a company to supply you with new kit or new equipment, they might request you to make a 50% deposit because some of the things they are supplying you with, they don't have them. They must also go and buy those things and take them for branding. So they might require you to pay an upfront deposit. Now those things must be done. Of course, there must be a contract. If you look at section number 2, which is very interesting, section number 2 is basically the whole legal framework in terms of managing a service provider. Now we're talking about the service level agreement on section number 2. Now the SLA must be provided. Now SLAs, you may not need to deploy the services of a lawyer. Of course, this depends on the nature of the company. It depends on how big is the organization. But for smaller companies, you can draft the SLA yourself. You could find some nice templates, and from the internet, you can customize it according to the needs of your company. But the main thing is that there must be a service level agreement that is signed between two companies. Now, the service level agreement should stipulate a number of things, such as the duration of the contract, the work that needs to be done, how much must this company be paid, when must they be paid. So all those things must be indicated on the contract, and the contract must be signed by the two organizations. Each company must have a copy of the signed contract. Now the SLA comes very handy when there is an issue or a dispute, or maybe the person is running away with the money, or the person doesn't want to work. Now when you are using lawyers to chase a service provider, one of the things the lawyer would ask for will be, is there a contract? Was there a contract signed between you and the service provider? Now the contract can be used to follow up or to chase the person. Number 3, we will look at the project plan. When you recruit or when you employ a service provider, or when you sign up a service provider, there must be a project plan. Somebody might ask a question and say, what is a project plan? Now a project plan is basically a plan of action. If it's a year project, we need to know what's going to happen in Jan, what's going to happen in Feb, what will happen in March, all the way until December. Now, one of the things we look at, or that the project plan should define, is the scope of the project. What is the project all about? What is it that these guys have been selected to do? So the SLA, or the project plan rather, should indicate what I call the scope of work. What is it that they need to do for you? So that's one of the key things on the project plan. The second thing on the project plan is the issue of the stakeholders. The stakeholders are the parties that are involved in a project. It could be the funder, it could be the service provider, it could be the host company. There could be many stakeholders in a project. And the third thing, we look at the project schedule. Project scheduling is basically the timelines. If it's a 12 months contract, we should define clearly that these are the responsibilities that we have in Jan. This must be done by March. This must be done by June. This must be done by September. And this must be done by December. Now, these are the activities that you can attach on the invoices. We call them deliverables. Now, before you pay a service provider, there must be a tick box exercise, because you cannot just pay when deliverables are not submitted. And the next thing we look at is the cost baselines. Now the cost, as you all know, that a project has got money. You cannot run a project without money. So one of the key things is that there must be a budget. A project must have a budget. And the reason why we have a budget, we are trying to avoid two things. The first thing, we're trying to avoid overspending by sticking to the budget. And also, of course, we also try to avoid underspending, because if we underspend, it could mean that we did not plan properly. And the next thing we look at is the communication plan or communication channels. When we run the project, if it's 20 people, that's a big team. Each team member needs to know that I report to so and so reports to so and so. So the communication channel or communication line must be clearly defined. Nobody should be confused. Now, one of the key things is that a project should be able to answer these questions, meaning a good project should address or should have answers to these questions. The first question that we should ask ourselves when we run a project is why? Why are we starting this project? What is the purpose? What are we trying to achieve? Why do we need equipment? What will it do for us? So these questions must be answered by the host company. Number two is, what is the project all about? What are we going to do? What is this project? What is the goal? What is the motive? And the third question is the who. Who is involved in the project? Now, the who talks about the stakeholders. Who is responsible for the project? So the who defines the different role players with their duties. And then, of course, the last question will be the when. The when talks about the timelines. There are two key timelines in a project. When do we start and when do we finish? And let me say this, that many projects, they tend to extend. And of course, a few projects tend to end before time. Now, when you plan, if a project is 12 months, it is always important to sort of have about a month or 2 months for remedial, to say, okay, the project should end in December, but we have Jan and Feb just to wrap it up. So that's very important. Even in your budget must not be very tight. There should be allowances for emergencies and anything that could come up that was not planned for, because that's the nature of life. Now, section number 4, we look at service provider, the selection process. Now, it has never been easy to select service providers. There are a number of things I would like us to look at. If you select a service provider, we could look at things such as, is this company reliable? Reliable means that if we pay them 50% deposit upfront, one day run away with the money. That's when now the issue of credit check, and just to validate the company and also to check their references, that these guys, have they worked before or we are their first client? Now, reliability means that the person will offer you what we have paid for. So you have to do your checks, do your homework. Don't just appoint anybody because he's your friend. And the next thing you need to look at is the quality. If they are selling products, for example, like let's say they are selling water, you may need to say to them, can you bring us a sample of what you are selling? We want to test the quality. If they are selling food, you may need to say, can we taste one of your recipes, so that we make sure that we buy or we know what we are buying. And the third thing will be value for money. Value for money does not necessarily mean cheap. Value for money means that, will I get what I've paid for? If I've paid this guy 10 rands, the service that he's giving me, is it at the value of money that I've given them? Meaning, if I've paid him 10 rands, what he's giving me, is it worth the 10 rands that I've paid him? So those key things are very, very much important. Now, I want us to look at the service provider selection process, which is very interesting. Now, companies have selected service providers that disappointed them at the end of the day, because some of the steps during the selection were violated, of course. Now, when you select a service provider, there should be a standard procedure that is defined by your organization. Of course, depending on the size of the company, but you don't just appoint somebody because he's your relative. You don't just appoint him because he's your friend. There should be a legitimate checklist, process, or procedure that is followed by your organization. Now, I'll just give you a basic process we've observed. You may want to change it if need be. For example, the first thing you will see when you appoint a service provider, you may need to advertise. Once again, this can depend on a number of things. You may advertise depending on the value of the contract. You may advertise because you don't know any service provider that can give you what you require. But just to be very basic and general, I'll say if you are looking for a service provider, it's always advisable to advertise. You could use a local newspaper, you can use a local radio station, or you could even put the information on your Facebook page. There are many ways you can advertise what you need to do. The second thing, after you advertise, you would perhaps say all interested organizations must come for a briefing. Now, a briefing, that's when they come to your company to be briefed about what you want them to do. Now, usually the rule will be any company that does not show up at the briefing session is disqualified from applying for the work. So let's assume that 10 companies have responded to the advert. At the briefing session, there must be an attendance register, and all 10 companies must be present. Any company that misses the briefing session is automatically disqualified from applying for that program or project. The next thing that you do after the briefing session, you perhaps let them apply and then you shortlist. Shortlist, it could be 3 companies that are the best. You shortlist company 1, company 2, company 3 because they've met the criteria. Then after the shortlisting, perhaps you could invite them for interviews just to talk to them face to face to see if perhaps, because you can't appoint all 3 of them, you may need to appoint 1. So to get to 1, there must be another strict process that would follow. Another thing that we would usually do is to get quotations. Quotations, they come with proposals. When they submit their proposals, they submit with quotations. Some companies will go with the cheapest quote, which it does not necessarily the best thing to do, or it's not always the best thing to do. Some companies would say whoever deserves it, even if it's cheaper or expensive, will give him the work. It's just that many times we tend to assume that companies don't have money, so the one with the cheapest quote is the one that will get the work. It's not always the case. Now, part of the quotation, there will be a list of documents that the company would need to submit, such as your tax certificates, your bank statements, the history of your work, your company profile, and all those things. Now, if a company is missing any of these important documents, usually that company will be disqualified from the selection process. Let's assume that their tax certificate is expired. Many companies will disqualify them. Or they did not submit an updated 3 months bank statement. Usually they will be disqualified. Now, when they get disqualified, usually what causes this, it will be minor things that maybe they forgot to attach. That's why when we are applying for a project as a service provider, that document pack that we have prepared, it is very important to double check and make sure that all the documents you've submitted are in good order and none of them have expired. And of course, that takes us to the next bullet, which says check for compliance. Do they have all the documents? You may need to call their references, but some people can write people that do not exist. Check with references. Who did they supply in the past? Were they happy with their service? All those things are important. And the next thing, should you decide to appoint one of the organizations, very important, a service level agreement must be signed by the two parties, by yourself, the host company, as well as the service providers. The last bullet I've got on this slide, it says, be careful about the payment terms. Now, this is very important. Many companies have lost money because they pay the service provider 100% upfront, which is very dangerous. Now, you cannot pay somebody all his money before he has done the work. I think it's common sense to me. So usually there will be 3 or 4 ways you can pay a service provider. The first one I wouldn't prefer is to pay them 100% before they do all the work, which is very risky. I mean, it's common sense to say, what if they run away with the money? The second option, some companies will say, let's pay them 50% upfront because they may need to buy some items. They may need to procure some goods, like the example I used earlier on. They may need to buy some paper, they may need to buy some equipment before they take it for branding. So they also need to cover the risk that they can stand. So that's important. The third category of payment, it could be somebody who says, okay, I want to pay you in 3 tranches. 3 tranches could be 33% times 3. So which is also safe. You might pay the first tranche when you sign the contract, the second tranche when the work is 50% done, and the third tranche can be paid when the work is 100% done. So that's important. But for me, the safest way has been 4 tranches. 4 tranches are very safe. The only disadvantage, it's a lot of administration work, because every time you pay, there must be a whole list of documents that must go with the invoice. But it's safe. 4 tranches can be divided into 4 quarters. In Jan, before they start, once the contract is signed, you pay 25%, which is tranche 1. Around March, Easter time, when they've done the work, they've done 25% of the work, they do tranche 2. In June or September, when they've done 50% of the work, they do tranche number 3. Then it goes on and on and on. In December, when they've done 70 or 100%, then they qualify for tranche number 4. Like I said to you, the only disadvantage with these 4 tranches is administration work. Every time you bill, there must be documents that go with the invoice. That's the only challenge you have. But for me, it has been the safest method to use when you're dealing with service providers. Now, section number 5, which is the last section now, is you review the work of the service provider for a number of reasons. You have to check and ask yourself a question. So far, have they done the job I've paid them for? Number 2, you might want to extend the contract, or it might be a continuous job or contract that is renewed yearly. Of course, before I renew your contract, I have to check, am I happy with your work? If I'm not happy with your work, I cannot renew your contract. Now, when you review the service provider, you are checking if you are happy with these guys so that you can build a future relationship. Now, one of the things you do when you review is to check the quality of the work. Are they giving me the best service? Check for innovations, because when you are helping a client, you don't just help the client, but you also help the client to also know the latest things that we've got in the industry. So you assist them to say, guys, did you know that next year we can improve this service by maybe adding a program or a software that will make it run better? So all these things, they come into play when you review the work of the service provider. And also you look at things like delivery when you review their work. Do they deliver on time? Are they punctual? Don't they deliver faulty goods? So all these things are very important. Now, if you are happy with their work, it's only then you can say, okay, you guys, next year, I want you to continue. So that's very important. Now, this is the end of the presentation, and I hope it makes a lot of sense. Now, before I finish, if you've got any questions, on the last slide, you've got our email address. If you've got any questions concerning this presentation, please feel free to send a mail to our academic email address, or you can send a WhatsApp to our cell phone number, which you've got on your slides. And let me emphasize once again that when you watch these lectures or videos, have your slides with you. I'll send you the slides on your email. I expect you to have your slide and your video, because when you watch the video, you have to refer to the slides so that you understand better. Now, what I'll do a little later on, I'll do the last unit standard of this module, and then I'm going to go through the portfolio of evidence questions so that you know exactly how to answer the questions. Thank you so much for your time, and I wish you all the best. Bye-bye.